Welcome back into the Rowdy Studio. I'm Stephen Levine, Tom Vandervoort on the end, and Bob Pockrass of Sporting News right smack dab in the middle. And Bob, Denny Hamlin is no longer a championship contender because of one little stupid switch on his race car that broke.
It's not a stupid switch. It's like the master switch.
Yeah, I know, but it's the thing is, you might say, oh, well, it was a fluky parts failure or a fluky assembly error, but there seems to be an ongoing issue with quality control at Joe Gibbs Racing, and you talked to Jimmy Makar, Senior Vice President of Racing Operations. Did he cop to that? Did he cop to the fact that there's a pattern here?
Well, no, I mean, he understands that there's a pattern. He said, of course, if he could understand why there's a pattern and why it happens to Denny Hamlin and not Kyle Busch and not Joey Logano during the chase, to let him know. He said, if I knew that answer, to make sure to let him know.
But it does happen to those other two guys.
Well, but it didn't the other day, and it didn't in the chase. And so, but he pointed out, Kevin Harvick had an engine issue, right? But Kevin Harvick isn't a championship contender, so it's not a big deal. But he says, yes, it's happened. And, he said, when he was crew chief for Bobby Labonte, winning the title in, 2000, they completed, he said, I think all but 9 miles.
That's pretty good.
During,
if you look at what happens to Gibbs, if you were to go back and calculate, you may have done this, Bob, I don't know, you're so diligent. If you were to take the top 4 or 5 teams and look at the number of mechanical, what they call engine failures or parts failures or little things like that, I submit to you, you would find more of those things happening to Joe Gibbs Racing than the other teams. Is that fair?
No. I mean, it's fair in some ways, but like if you looked at engine issues and who's had to replace engines, like Toyota versus, I want to say Hendrick. Hendrick, I think, has replaced a lot more engines this year than Toyota. So, but they didn't seem to have 3 in a row go on one guy like Kyle Busch had. Mm-hmm. I mean, Jimmy said, they'll keep looking at things and keep trying to, unfortunately, keep trying to figure out what went wrong. He said, unfortunately, sometimes you don't know what's wrong until a part fails, right? And so, they're going to keep working on it.
There are 2 possibilities, right? It could have been a parts failure, or it could have been a human error in the way the part was installed.
Right, and they're still looking at that for what happened on the other day. He said they do for cars that are in the chase. You have a lifelong expectancy for a part. And he said all the parts in the chase car are somewhere between 20% and 80% of their life expectancy. So you don't necessarily have something new that would just break right away.
It's been used, so in a way it's been tested already.
Correct, but then it's not.
But it's not so close to when you would expect it to fail.
Correct. So he says and he says they'll keep looking at that and seeing if they need to adjust that as well.
Is there anything, do you think, in their overall quality control procedures that is different in some way from other race teams, or is this kind of a standard procedure that most teams have?
I think it's hard to tell. I mean, when you look at a team like Hendrick, and they have 450 employees, they have more than what they have at Gibbs, right? So do they maybe have somebody who
double checks the double checker?
Exactly, or maybe they have a way of analyzing life expectancy for parts and pieces that might be better than what they do at Gibbs.
Right.
Or, maybe they maybe at times are maybe more conservative than what Gibbs is. Maybe is Gibbs going out on a limb on some things. I think it's hard to tell. I mean, remember, didn't Denny Hamlin in 2010, didn't they say it was a new carburetor they were using? I believe right? When they had the problem at Phoenix, and so you kind of take a risk sometimes when you use something new.
It strikes me that Jimmy Makar was the first crew chief they ever hired at Joe Gibbs Racing, right? Wasn't he hired to take over not take over, but to become Dale Jarrett's crew chief?
He was basically hired to build the race team, I think.
He's been there from the very beginning, and he's been elevated to this position of Senior Vice President for Racing Operations. Would they benefit from having somebody from another team, somebody from the outside, come in with some perspective and take a look at these processes and say, well, you guys could, maybe you need to change this or change that or do this a little different?
Well, I mean, do they have that in Darian Grubb? I mean, who would be able to say that kind of thing? I mean, it may help them, but, I think they hire enough people from the outside who, if they wanted to listen to them, should be able to look at that. I mean, but that might be one of their answers is, hey, let's take
a bigger step back as opposed to just what happened with this one case. Can we take a bigger step back? Do you get the sense they're thinking that way?
I don't. I think they're probably looking at it and kind of more methodically and thinking, hey, what do we need to do? But it's again, I think you have so many people who come through. They may not need to hire somebody, but they may need to just tap into the resources that they have, right? And say, hey, what do you, sometimes people maybe just don't speak up, right? Maybe just go about and do your job.
Nobody here. And of course, next year they're going to have Matt Kenseth. Maybe he'll bring a little bit of a fresh eye or a fresh approach to things.
Oh, I can see him going around checking the master switches. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't think he's a hands-on kind of? No. All right. Well, that's Bob. That's Dom. I'm Steven. Thanks for watching.